Did you know that the country of Australia may never have existed as it is today if it weren't for the Muslims? You see, Australia is a massive country. It's so big you could fit most of Europe within its borders. But if you've ever taken a look at a map of Australia, you'll notice something interesting. Most of the country is harsh and desolate, covered in red sands of the outback, but along the coasts the weather is cooler and the terrain is much easier to live in. All of Australia's major cities, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Darwin, they're all situated along these coasts of Australia. Which raises the question, how do you connect these cities when there are thousands of miles of desert between them? Well, in the early 1800s, European settlers began to migrate in waves, setting up colonies all around the country, which would eventually become these major cities. And it was around that same time that steam-powered trains were beginning to find use in Europe. It was a massive leap forward in technology. Now people and cargo could be transported across vast distances in no time and at the fraction of a cost of horses and carts. For example, a trip from London to Edinburgh used to take 10 days, but could now be done in only 45 hours. It was a perfect solution to connect places that were far away from each other and didn't have access to waterways where boats could travel. And all you needed was some flat land to lay the tracks. But there was just one problem. In Europe and the US, you could use horses to drive caravans, bring food and supplies to the workers while the railway was being built. But you couldn't do that in Australia. The Australian outback was just too arid and the desert climate too harsh for horses to handle. And it would be another few decades until cars were invented, let alone mass-produced. So they came up with a solution. Australia was still part of the British Empire, and the Brits were kind of in the middle of invading this part of Asia right here. And they just so happened to have camels over there with people who knew how to use them. So maybe if they could just get some camels and some camel drivers, then they could build the railways in the desert. So in 1938, the first camel arrived, which they named Harry. And they began bringing in cameleers mostly from Afghanistan, but some from Pakistan, India, Iran, Egypt, and Turkey as well, to begin work on the railways. They began by creating a network of transportation throughout the outback. They worked with Australian expeditions to explore the country, finding the best routes for transportation and for natural resources to mine for. Then they set up supply chains for each route with stations called caravansarais along the way for travelers to rest and resupply for their journey. And when new mines were built as a result of previous expeditions finding natural resources, the cameleers provided supplies for those as well. As they worked their way inland, exploring the interior of the country, they began other construction projects as well. In the west side of Australia, they built the longest unbroken fence in the world to protect the coastal agricultural lands from pests like rabbits. It was a massive project, 1,100 miles long, that took over 6 years to build. In another example, the cameleers worked with engineers to build and maintain a 2,000-mile-long telegraph line across the interior of the country. And when it was linked to the global network through Indonesia, the communication time with Europe dropped from months to hours. Australia was no longer isolated from the rest of the world. And eventually construction on the railway network would begin. The Queensland Railway was built along the northeast coast, connecting Brisbane to a network of settlements up there. In the south, Port Augusta was connected to Perth and Port Pirie was connected to Sydney, until finally they decided to connect those two ports together, covering the entire width of Australia in track. They also worked on lines connecting Adelaide to Melbourne and Port Augusta to Darwin in the north, but these lines were only finished long after the Afghans had already left. And as the Muslim cameleers continued to build the infrastructure of Australia, uniting the settlements into one country, several times disaster struck, and each time the Afghans came to the rescue. In 1895, the continent experienced a 7-year drought, one of the worst in its history. The Afghans worked endlessly, providing food, water, and supplies to the settlements that were in desperate need during this time. Without them, small towns like Wilcannia, White Cliffs, Tibubura, Milparinka, and other towns would have practically ceased to exist. In another instance, the Afghans saved the population of Cunnamulla from semi-starvation after floods cut the town off from all other modes of transportation. And throughout this time, many Muslim entrepreneurs and businessmen arose along with the camel routes, providing resupply, maintenance, transportation services to whoever needed it. Many of them made a profit which they could then reinvest into other businesses, building a small fortune in the process. And then they would use that fortune to build masjids across the country. For example, the Central Adelaide Mosque and the Perth Mosque were both built by these businessmen and still stand till this day. It's safe to say that Muslims were vital to the Australian society, but not all of the Australians saw it that way. Most of the Afghans had left their families behind and lived alone in the outback. They were forced to live in camps called Gan towns away from the white populations. And one Gan town in particular became so large it merged into the nearby white settlement, which, by the way, was where the first masjid in Australia was built. The white population couldn't accept this, so they split the town into one side for the whites and one side for the Afghans and the Aboriginals, which is quite interesting. The Aboriginal people of Australia actually took kindly to the Afghans and had some kind of a mutual understanding with them. When the Afghans were exploring the deserts, the Aboriginals helped them find food and water supplies for their camels, and many of the Afghans married into Aboriginal families, having children together whose descendants form a small Muslim community in Australia today. By the way, there were also some reports of white women joining the Afghan communities, marrying and even becoming Muslim, and traveling for Hajj. This was obviously much less common. But the problem was that often these marriages were considered illegal because Afghans couldn't get marriage licenses from the local governments, and Christian missionaries would then take their children by force to be housed in Christian schools. In other circumstances, the Afghans who were successful enough to be able to travel between Afghanistan and Australia were sometimes stopped randomly at the border and barred from re-entry, meaning they could never return to their businesses or their families that they left behind ever again. But all this came to an end in the late 1930s. The Afghan cameleers were slowly being phased out as the car was now being mass-produced and Australia was building its first roads throughout the outback. Jobs for them were becoming more and more difficult to find, and discrimination against them was still prevalent. And most of them have made their way back home from where they originally came from, leaving Australia for good. Today, things have changed a little bit, and the Afghans are slowly getting more and more recognition for the work that they did in building Australia. You can find monuments to the Afghans like this one in Adelaide or this one in Alice Springs. There's also a train that runs a 54-hour journey from Adelaide to Darwin called the GAN, which is short for the Afghan Express. It's one of those nostalgic tourist experience trips and is often ranked among the best in the world, actually. And in one of the most bizarre turns of events, the camels themselves have ended up becoming part of Australia's modern economy. When the cameleers left Australia, they released their camels into the wild, fearing that the local authorities would just shoot and kill them. And estimates now show that there could be up to 1 million camels in the outback, making Australia the country with the most camels in the world. Not Saudi Arabia or Somalia, Australia. In fact, Saudi Arabians actually buy a lot of their camels from Australia because they're delicious and Saudi doesn't have enough of their own to eat. But perhaps the most important thing the Afghans left behind were their children. Today, you'll find the descendants of those Muslim cameleers living throughout the country, many of which still hold on to their Afghan heritage and keep their Islamic traditions. The cameleers who died in Australia were buried and have their graves scattered across the country, and their descendants are often buried beside them in Muslim graveyards. What the Afghans built in Australia was nothing short of spectacular. The supply lines they carved through the desert and the transportation networks they built were fundamental, not only in developing Australia into the wealthy country it is today, but in connecting the various settlements into a unified country in the first place. It's amazing to see the effects that Muslims have had even in countries as far away as Australia, even if they're just barely hidden beneath the surface.